Hello, everyone, and welcome to Live with Lisa. And today, my guest host, Ronin Colman, is joining me. Where are you, Ronin? Where in the world? Are you Texas?
Yeah, Texas, near Fort Worth.
All right. Well, I'm joining you from Arizona. If you're just tuning in for the first time, or maybe you join us every time, drop a little note in the chat for us and let us know where you're tuning in from. Say hi, just so that I can know you can hear us okay. We're in for a real treat today. Ronin is a longtime family friend. We go way back. I was a teenager, I think, when my stepfather Bear introduced me to you, and I do remember him, maybe tongue in cheek, holding you responsible for dragging him onto the board of directors for the NRA. What was that?
That would be true.
Was
He
that back
never
when?
forgave me.
No, I wouldn't either. Was Charlton Heston the president at that time?
He came in during the middle of our term.
All right. That was a long time ago, so it's been a while. And for those of you who are joining us today, I just wanted to let you know that this is not going to be our typical show. It's much more shooting from the hip. Ronin is not in the business of helping inventors. He is a successful inventor and entrepreneur himself. And we were chatting the other day, and I just started thinking, God, I wish that there were other people that could hear this conversation, because he's such a wealth of information. And so you won't be able to find him. He's off the radar, off the grid for the most part. You won't even find him on LinkedIn, but you have him here today, thankfully, to ask your questions. So feel free to start dropping those questions in the chat. As they come up, I'll take them on a first come, first serve basis. And before we jump into those questions, though, Ronan, thank you so much for being here and helping me with this. I know
My
it's outside
pleasure.
the zone. Why don't you, if you don't mind, start by just giving the folks a little bit of your background and catch us up to what you do today, so that people understand what your background is and what kinds of
Sure.
questions.
Yeah. So what I do today is pretty much what I did at the beginning of this company, which is we make electronic products for mainly competitive shooters and recreational shooters. How that started was when I was 17. I was in the first class ever held at Gunsight, which was the original private shooting school in Arizona, north of Prescott, and went back and worked there. Left after about 3 years, got on my motorcycle, rode to Texas, and was essentially unemployable, lacking much in the way of education or skill set other than teaching people how to shoot, which at the time, today, the people teaching you how to shoot all over the place. There's no shortage. Well, back then I was it in the Dallas area. So I started teaching these gun schools to the locals, made some decent money doing that, had some fun, met interesting people, some of which pretty inspirational. And along the way, in the type of shooting we were doing back then and to this day, we not only measure accuracy, but we measure time. And we would use stopwatches. And a person would shoot a certain course of fire, and then there'd be a plate that he'd have to hit and knock down to stop the time. And the judge, this is in the early 80s, and the judge would be looking at the plate. And when he saw the plate fall, he'd hit the button on a stopwatch. So I had gone to high school in the Palo Alto area. I used to ride my mini bike in an area now known as Silicon Valley, and grew up around people actually building computers from kits. And so it was not foreign to me to make an electronic product that would basically be a glorified stopwatch. It would hear the sound of the gun and record those times like hitting the split button on a stopwatch. And then we record them in memory. A person could play it back and see what his different times were. Today you'd go, well, that's no big deal. Well, in 1982, that was a big deal.
That was a big deal. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was. And because there's also almost nobody in the firearm industry that made anything electronic. So that product kind of blossomed into others. I mistakenly thought back then that everybody that shot firearms did what my group did, which was practice and try to get better, when in fact that's a tiny portion of the firearm world. But then we got into things that more people were interested in, like we made chronographs, which tells you how fast a bullet's going. The biggest thing we did back then was make electronic scales, which we sold under our own brand and under a different company's brand, making them for them. And we caught the transition of reloaders going from balance beam scales to electronic scales. So in a course of a few year period, we sold about 250,000 of those. In fact, we were the largest manufacturer of that class of scale in America, which is to say everybody else went to China. But so it's been an interesting thing. Now the shooting timers are big again, so that works for us.
Shooting timers. Obviously you found this niche and you've carved it out. It's kind of like when I first started with the French twisters. I have hair, I like doing it, so that was my niche. And when it came time to invent again, it was just natural for me to continue to stay in that category because I already knew and had relationships with the companies and knew what the demand was, and all of that stuff was worked out. Did you choose to stay, or have you ever gone outside of the gun electronics?
Well, I've gone outside of the electronic part in that I have another company that makes triggers for rifles, but every foray I have taken out of the firearm industry, I have failed dismally. Um, so,
What?
well, right. So it's an industry I've been in one way or another again since I was 17. I know the people, I know the customers, I know the problems they have, and I can come up with solutions to those problems. Just because I drift over and do into another field, I may take my arrogance with me, but I don't really know anything about it. We tried making, actually, I did make very briefly foot pegs for dirt bikes, motorcycles. And back then it was real big that people would put on custom handlebars. Well, your other point of control is your feet. And most of the foot pegs on motorcycles were awful. And so back then there was a company called Peterson Publishing, which Gary, your stepfather, worked for. And they had Guns and Ammo magazine. They also had Dirt Rider. So I was very impressed with myself. So I go to call the editor of Dirt Rider to tell him how great my foot pegs are and why he needs to put them in his magazine, yada, yada, yada. Of course, he wouldn't take my call because who am I in the motorcycle world? I'm nobody. So I called the editor of Guns and Ammo, who walked down the hall to the editor of Dirt Rider and said, "Hey, talk to this guy." But yeah, I fooled around making some aviation stuff. There was probably lack of appreciation of the engineering requirements of the thing I wanted to make, and threw a bunch of money at some products that lived in a warehouse till I cleaned it out and took them to the dump.
No, you didn't even like close them out and sell them. You literally just threw them away.
They weren't. They were of no use other than as a trophy to business mistakes. Um, so not everything has been a success.
I can't imagine. I have similarly bad experience when I got too far outside of my niche and went into toys. That's what cost me basically bet the farm on it and lost it all. So have you ever licensed any of those?
No, I have made. I have been an OEM supplier to other well-branded companies, but I always made the product and sold it to them. Then they resold it. We'll put their name on it, and then they would resell it. But never done the licensing thing.
So can you explain for anyone who might be listening that's not familiar with what OEM is and how that relationship?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So OEM is original equipment manufacturer, and so let's say I had a company that made shock absorbers, and I sold those shock absorbers to Ford. So I would be an OEM supplier to Ford. And so in that, well, like with the scales, we found a company that really wanted an electronic scale, and a big company, and within their internal bureaucracy and whatnot, it would take them forever to make their own. They were buying them from another domestic manufacturer, now gone, for way too much money. They weren't price competitive. And so we were able to strike a deal with them where we agreed on some different channels of distribution that I would stay out of, and they stayed out of some other places I didn't want them in. And that was a very, very successful partnership. But it certainly wasn't a licensing thing. They went through, which is common in the firearm industry, three-step distribution. So they would sell to a distributor, who would sell to a dealer, who would sell to a end user.
All
Where
that,
we always, with a lot of cash getting scraped off in the process,
right.
where we always sold, to this day, still sell factory direct to end users, which if you're a manufacturer is not a bad model. And it certainly in the internet era has become even easier to do that.
Do you still need intellectual property like patents to make that work?
I have patents, but they're not needed to make it work at all. Um, for one thing, I think we talked about this the other day a little bit. Since the American Invent Act was passed by the Obama and the Republicans, the patent law changed to very much favor an infringer, where before it was a little more stacked toward the inventor. Um, so I have licensed a patent and once, and then paid the royalty on it, and the original holder of the patent couldn't afford to defend the patent against infringers. He then sold it to a big company which did set out to enforce the patent. They had the money to do it. The law changed and they lost in court. So that's my one experience with patents. I think they only dropped about $500,000 on legal bills.
Only. Yeah, only.
Yeah.
That's not exactly easy for someone who's just got a really good idea and is thinking about possibly taking this path as opposed to just traditionally licensing.
Well, I think where you need a patent is if you're ever going to sell your company or sell the product line to a bigger company, they're going to want to see that patent. Never mind that it's the defensibility of it notwithstanding. You know, a patent is something that you can sell, which is a little different than licensing it. And so, for example, another company that we made an OEM, very much niche OEM product for, the owner of that company insisted that I get a patent, or he wouldn't do the deal with me.
Right.
Not that he was going to pay to defend the patent. He just wanted to see that patent number. Okay.
And probably wants the exclusivity and the competitive advantage of it, I would assume, in the process as well.
Well, he did have an exclusive from us. Like, we weren't going to sell it to anybody else or sell it under our own brand name. It would have been a very difficult thing to copy. And they were the #1 brand in their area. But nevertheless, it was, he wanted a patent, so I went and got a patent. Yeah,
Right,
never had it. And I will have to say, actually, in that space, there was a guy that came along that wanted to make a product that would have bumped into the patent and didn't because of the patent. But it probably wasn't so much because of the patent, it was because of the big mega company that we were making them for. And in that industry, if they had angered that company, they would have had a problem. Like, they wouldn't be able to get their products in the big catalogs in that area.
Anyway, yeah. All right, so I just want to remind everybody, you can start dropping your questions in just a moment. I'm going to hop over there and start running through them in the order that they've come in. But before we go to that, Ronin, in just trying to help everybody wrap their minds around this OEM option versus licensing, if you have something that someone else could make because you don't have a patent on it, other than it being complicated, like you said, difficult, what would be a reason for an inventor, someone who has an idea that they really believe would be a part of a bigger product or a bigger package? Like, maybe it would be something that would be dropped in a gift basket that's shipped on those monthly subscriptions or whatever. When should someone choose that path over just licensing?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a question of successful sales. So a lot of these big companies that have a well-known brand and have lots of products, when they introduce a new product, never mind it's a product I made for them, it's seen as a product from them. So I could go out and beat my head against the wall trying to sell a product under my own brand name in a market of which I have no brand equity. Or I could sell my product, obviously at a discount, to somebody who's successful in that market and have immediate sales. And I also am stopping them from competing against me by going and sourcing the product, either making it themselves or buying it somewhere else.
But how are you stopping them from making it and selling it? Because if you don't have the intellectual property, where's your competitive advantage or barrier to entry, I guess?
Well, so the advantage is that, and it doesn't last forever, I might add, neither do patents. The advantage is it's easy for them. Nothing much happened. A lot of these guys are financials driven, and all of a sudden a product's showing up and their numbers go up and everybody's happy. And also, because I'm a manufacturer that sells factory direct, I can, if price is an issue, and I've always avoided price-based products, In other words, sales based on low cost. If price is an issue, I can always undercut them in the market because I don't go through three-step distribution. So there, we have an incentive to stay friends.
Are there certain categories that lend itself better to this business model, you think, than others?
Well, for me, yeah, because I can make electronic stuff, and if I looked at fields where it's a good field, there's key brands in it, but they don't have an electronic product. If I could fit an electronic product in there, I'd kind of search that out on the OEM side. Yeah, but I'm sure there are areas where that doesn't apply at all, but that's how I do it.
Right on. When you say that you're the manufacturer, are you actually physically making the goods? You have a building and employees, or are you still outsourcing that?
Both. So we do some outsourcing. In the electronic world, it's evolved a bit over the years. Unless you were really tiny volume or mega volume, you would not, it doesn't pay to manufacture themselves. By that, I mean soldering the parts on the board, screwing things together. So in the electronic world, that's most commonly done with what's called an electronic contract manufacturer. And we've used the same guys for decades. They do a fine job. They're right down the street from me. On the trigger side, all of those are assembled by us. And some machining functions are outsourced to different local vendors. But that's
so it takes a village. It takes
Pardon
a
me?
village. The whole
Well,
village.
yeah, there's different philosophies on that. I'm not a neat desk person, and I don't want a machine shop, and I don't want to have a product that unless I'm, as they say in the machine business, making chips, I don't make money. That's not my value added. The headaches that go from trying to be in the manufacturing, we call it completely vertically integrated. It's possible, and there's some great companies out there that do it, but it's extremely capital intensive. And basically, when my sales go down, my expenses track down with them. That's not necessarily true if you're a vertically integrated manufacturer.
Yeah.
Like you start laying people off and selling off the machinery that you can't make the payments on. So I've avoided all that.
Do you think, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask one last question, and then I promise you,
Sure.
Celeste, let's see here. It's Kimberly. I'm going to come back to your question in just a moment, Kim. Do you think that there is more money, along with more risk, but more money to be made by setting yourself up as an OEM versus licensing? Because there's a lot more work involved in it, but it's also sold at a lower cost. So I'm not sure how that works.
Well, sure. So again, I've never done the licensing thing, but the amount of, if they can only get the product from me, and I know what it costs to make it, and I know what they're going to sell it for, they would never pay me, a 70% royalty. Like, they'd be nuts. Now, on the other hand, if they can make it themselves and they're an honorable company and they're going to respect my patent and, pay me 2% of something, which ought to be gross sales, yeah, I would consider that for sure.
Well, it kind of is. The only thing, it's 3 to 5 kind of range, sometimes as high as 8, but it's usually 3 to 5. And the royalty rate is paid based on what they sell it for. And the only thing that they take back out is if they take anything out, would be commission and freight. So I'm wondering how that would work out. But before we dive too deep into that, I know that you do really well on Amazon. You've had your trials and tribulations kind of figuring it out. And I remember back when you first started doing it, and it was like driving you crazy. And now you've kind of got a machine going for you. So Kim wanted to know, she says, good morning. I have thought of offering my product to an Amazon seller. What would I look for in a seller?
Well, so we have been down the painful learning curve on that. And this is not a reflection on Amazon, it's a reflection on Amazon sellers. So there's a bunch of people that sell on Amazon successfully, who buy our products, and they have nothing to do with our industry. What they look for is products that, what they're basically looking to make is inventory turns. And so they might buy a product from us before we crack down on this, and they might only make $1 or $2 on the product, but they're turning that over, call it 5%, make up a number, but they're turning it over every month, which is extremely lucrative for them. The problem comes in trying to maintain your price structure, which is essential. Because if you have, dealers and good guys on Amazon selling it, and you establish a minimum price, a MAP price, and then you get one of these Amazon resellers and say, oh, we want to buy, 1,000 of your gizmo. Oh, great. Well, I want to sell you 1,000 of my gizmo. And then you sell it to them and they put it on Amazon and discount it, which wipes out all the other sellers and makes them furious with you, and they'll quit buying. And so actually, it's my son, Pierce, has done a great job with the help of a couple of these resellers of pruning anybody that goes below MAP pricing. And we tell them we're going to do it. Like, you violate MAP and you're out. And we keep any new person from having much in the way of inventory, so they can't really hose people very badly. And you've seen it when you go to buy something on Amazon and they say available from these other sellers, and you see this list and the products are like pennies apart in price. That's the thing, in my view, you're trying to avoid on Amazon, because if you let your price structure erode, there's no stopping it.
Yeah, interesting. And they've had to make all of these systems and processes and best practices up over the years, because there's always something new coming up that someone is trying to tweak this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we finally got into a high enough tier in our category at Amazon that we actually have a person we can talk to, which is
what?
Oh yeah, no, they.
Wait, I thought they were all robots. You can't possibly.
They're mostly robots. And that's been helpful for sure. But the Amazon deal is it's a two-edged sword, but I got to say we do sell a lot of products through there, and it would be crazy to not look at them.
I don't want to put you on the spot, so you don't have to answer specifically, but a lot is relative and means different things to different people. What are we talking about?
Well, I'm not going to be building space shots with Elon Musk next week, but I would say our sales are probably over half through Amazon now, which that did not used to be the case. It used to be we had a couple of big catalog guys that sold most of the products that we didn't sell ourselves, and Amazon beats them out. Another thing for Kimberly to look at with Amazon and Amazon resellers is a bunch of these folks, what they really want you to do is ship your product directly to Amazon for them. Like, okay, why don't we just ship it directly to Amazon for ourselves? So we don't do that. We did it first, but we don't do it anymore. So if somebody wants to buy, 100 of our gizmos, we're going to send them the 100, and they can worry about whether they're going to fulfill them themselves or stock them literally at an Amazon warehouse, which nothing is cheap with Amazon. It's all coming out of your pocket. So that's another thing to kind of beware of there.
Buyer beware. So Deb asks, who do you manufacture for? Is it just for companies?
So, yes, if I'm understanding the question. So, well, we manufacture to make a product that we're going to sell to a consumer, and we also manufacture to make a product that we're going to OEM to a manufacturer. But we're not a contract manufacturer. In other words, if you came to me and said, hey, can you make this widget for me? I'd say, no, but I know a guy that can.
And would you be willing to do that if somebody, because I'll have them reach out to me, if someone needed something electronics, what would be the best thing for me to ask you for if I'm looking for direction with something to get made?
I would, well, what you'd want to do is do the old Google is your friend. And in your area, in your local area, if you're near any kind of major metropolis, are going to be these things called electronic contract manufacturers, ECMs. And there's going to be several of them, because it's not hard to be in that business. There's not a big barrier to entry. And in my view, you want to have a personal face-to-face relationship with your vendors. And so I would use a local ECM wherever you happen to be, and go talk to them.
What you mentioned earlier, you've had some failures. can't be in this business long enough. In fact, if you don't fail, you're not doing it right. So what would you say has been the biggest success that you've had, and what did you learn from that?
The biggest success or the biggest failures?
Success first.
Oh, success first.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest thing I've learned from my successes has been uh, that there's an element of luck to all this, of something really catching on that you didn't expect to catch on. I've had things that I thought would catch on that flopped. Um, and so I think that uh, with the successes, I really knew the market well. Like when we did the scales, I very much knew the market well. And so I'd say my successes have been where I knew the market well. Another thing I should point out is um, I am an innovator. So in many of these products that we made over the years, I was the first person to do it. And it's not always, in a business sense, it's not always best to go first, because what you sometimes are doing is inventing somebody else's product line, and they get to see all your little mistakes and correct them. Um, so I think there's a book written about that called The Innovator's Dilemma. Um,
Yeah.
but that's a thing.
Yeah, it is. And we stumble around answering that question. I wanted to ask it first because I suspect it's a lot easier for me to ask you, what was your biggest failure and what did you learn from that?
The failure thing. Yes, that's what you want to avoid, is the management of risk, or you want to embrace the management of risk. I would say that the biggest failures have been sort of being my own fanboy and not really getting out, especially with complicated products, of not really getting out there and making sure that people are going to get it. Because when you make a product that never existed before, it isn't like people go, "Oh, got to have it. What does it do again?" So that sort of market research, which I think is pretty typical of entrepreneurs, is failing completely in market research. Um, when I get asked, about, how can you make, people come to me once in a while because I'm a rare bird and that I make things. And I said, well, I got this idea for this product. I just don't know how to make it. And my canned answer for 20 something years has been, let's not worry about that. Truck drove up, it's filled with the gizmos that you want. Tell me how you're going to sell them. Tell me how you're going to find your customer and how you can afford to find your customer. Because if you can't answer that question, don't start.
Right. I have people, it's not a field of dreams, folks. If you build it, they don't come.
No, that warehouse I cleared out, that was if I build it, they will come.
One of those situations. Yeah. So what do you do now to evaluate the opportunity before you go investing a bunch of time and money?
Well, so now, again, I stay in my lane. So I'm very much, over in the firearm generally field. I look at what's out there. I look at if my existing branding is going to be helpful for that product. I look at, it's just the old SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And, you really want to go out and like, who are your competitors? What is their reaction going to be to your product? How can you be torpedoed? What are the opportunities? It's, like that little midget that ran for president and put Bill Clinton in Ross Perot used to say, so you knew I was going to get there. He used to say, business is a contact sport. And it is, I mean, it is. Your competitors want to cut your throat, and they will, given the opportunity.
So if you need to know the answers to those questions, and I may get myself in trouble asking you this, I reserve the right to tell everyone, don't listen to you when you're done. But
okay.
I'm just curious. I want to know, when you know that you need to know the answers to those questions, what action do you take to really evaluate? Do you have a brainstorming session with the team and just say, what do you guys think? Do you go outside of that space? Do you interview people, focus groups? What?
Sure. So I have a very small group of confidence in the firearm industry. One fellow in particular who's been in the ad sales side of it forever. In fact, he knew Gary, and he, basically sells ads to all kind of companies in our field and is very aware of what's out there. So I'll talk to him. Again, having been at this for
makes it easier.
Near 40 years, forever. I know people throughout the industry to talk to, um, and I'm pretty empathetic in putting myself into the shoes of the customer in my field. Like
Mm-hmm.
not in hair products, not going to be doing that this week.
Right,
But
right. Probably
you
good.
know,
Well, it's like,
and I follow a pattern. So there was a guy out of Harvard named Porter who wrote a book called Competitive Advantage, and it's basically how to look at companies and analyze what their response to your actions is going to be. He wrote another book called Competitive Strategy, which is analyzing industries, which is a whole different world. Um,
yeah.
like, do
So,
you want to be in this industry at all? You know,
so
and,
asking,
and
knowing people, stay in your lane, knowing the right people to talk to who obviously have the wisdom and the expertise because they've been doing it a long time. What about, do you ever approach the potential company that you want to sell it to early and say, if I make this, would you want it? Or do you wait to sell it?
yes, no, I've done it both ways. With the scales, we were already making the product, so I could go here. And in fact, I have scale number one that we painted in that company's corporate colors and bluffed them a little bit. Um,
Nice.
Actually, bluffed them a lot. And then uh, let's see. I've also done the thing that if I build this, will you take it on? That was the guy that wanted me to have the patent. And then I've recently saw an opportunity to make a product, and we have no branding in that area, but I can make the product, and I think it'd be a good product. And we went to a big company, well-branded company in that area, and they just weren't interested. Like it was going to take, they said, well, build it, and then we'll see if we like it. Well, no, it'll cost me $100,000 to build it. So let's have a little more dialogue. And their sales are through the roof, and they didn't see the need. That may change. Um,
Uh, okay, cool. So we have some questions here. I want to jump in and get answered. Deb is asking, oh, sorry, we already answered that one. Treva. Thank you, Treva. It is interesting. Here we go. What about medical products? So I need you to be more specific, I think, Treva, in terms of manufacturing, or what is your question? Go ahead and drop that back down in the comment for me.
Well, I'll give her an answer to that.
What about
I
medical?
wish well, given my talent set of little inventor boy and making things, if I could roll the clock back, I would have made medical products, medical devices, because of the enormous markup in that industry. I'm not going to do it today, but if
And
I could roll it back,
it's a
pardon
bigger
me?
category too.
It's
Bigger
a
universe.
huge category. One thing that I would say that's a negative to it is medical devices are highly regulated. And I'm aware of a company, in fact, they used to be next door to me, who, was going to get rich off some magic electronic medical gizmo they made. And they missed the fact that there was no compensation code for it. So there's this committee, some governmental committee, and they meet every 2 years and they approve or disapprove things for compensation under Medicaid or care, one of those. And if you don't have a compensation code, you can't get paid. Like, you're done. And they miss that little gem. So if you're going to move into a highly regulated industry, you need to know what those regulations are backward and forward before you step in.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Lots of different people and moving parts. And it's Treva, not Treva. I am so sorry. I don't know why that just slipped out because I know better. I know Treva. And so that's the right way to say her name. Okay. This one, I don't know. Is it canon, you think? What do you think?
I think it's really little letters.
So he actually mentioned earlier that he got an AT trigger. Here we go. He got an AT trigger for an AR, still needs to install it. And now he would like to know, do you invest in others, other new product ideas, other people's? Or if so, what are your requirements?
As a passive investor, I've been an angel investor a couple times, just because. As an act, as a passive investor, I would be very reluctant to do that. And I don't like to work all that much, and so I don't think I could do the passive investment thing. I think I would freak out. And talk about staying in your lane. Everything I've ever invested in outside of myself has lost money, even though I follow other knowledgeable people in. So I'm talking
That
about oil wells and other ridiculousness.
Oh, yeah. No, that's very different. If someone had an idea in your category other than licensing, would you consider joint venturing or in
Oh,
that would
sure.
you're still on it?
Yeah, no, if somebody came to me with a product that was a fit for our branding and our, kind of our, what we do, I would absolutely entertain that. We've never done it, but I've had people do it, approach me for it. The first thing I make anybody do that, hey, I got this idea and I want to know if you license it or, pay me royalty or whatever. The first thing I do is make them make me sign a non-disclosure, you know. And I would tell you that for any of your listeners, if you've got somebody that won't sign a non-disclosure, don't talk to them. That's a big one. And not that you can
Unless
necessarily
you're
afford.
unless you're patent pending.
Well, if you're patent pending, you've already disclosed it.
Right.
I mean, by the definition, you created a
Yeah.
bar date and all
Yeah.
that. But if you're pre-patent pending, you got to do the NDA. Well, other than as a litmus test for the character of the person you're dealing with, you also, when you demonstrate something to somebody, absent that NDA, you've created a bar date in the patent system.
Right.
So then you got a year to patent it or it goes public.
Right.
One of those little nuances. I don't know, is that still true?
Yes, it is. Once
Under the
you have 12 months from when you publicly disclose your idea. So that's offering it for sale or just talking about it on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. You have 12 months. And if you don't file for a patent, then it goes into the public domain and no one can ever file for a patent on it again at that point. So yes, you are correct. Okay, so you were talking about that competitive advantage earlier, and
Yep.
I think that when we license, we want to license to companies. In fact, I usually recommend to look for that sweet spot of companies that are making between $100 and $500 million because they have enough distribution at 100 million that I know that I'll make a decent living off of a license deal with them at that 100 to 500 million. And if they're too much bigger than that, then I have to deal with their legal and I get lost in their product mix. And so when I'm looking for someone that's going to give me that competitive advantage, those are the brands that I'm looking for. What is it in the OEM space that gives you that competitive advantage that would make them want to continue to work with you to buy the product as opposed to sourcing it someplace else?
With our electronic products, again, we were dealing with companies that really didn't have the capacity to make an electronic product. And so that was, why that worked. On the trigger side of things, we have a very unique product, very high end. And then we're reasonably well branded in that area. And so the OEM guy, like we have a thing we say in the industry is trigger sell rifles. So a guy's looking at a rifle and he's, checks the action and what do they all do? You watch Gary do it 1,000 times, they dry fire it. And they immediately judge the rifle by the quality of the trigger. So we make the best trigger. And could somebody else, make it, copy it or something? Sure, people have. But we're also, well branded, and we also have a relatively low manufacturing cost for what it is we make. Every trigger we make is 100% QC tested by 2 different people before it leaves the door. All of them. Our whole deal is we don't ship a bad product. And so that's a plus. And we try to be a low hassle vendor. Like with our OEM trigger customers, we don't ever want to be the reason somebody couldn't ship a rifle. This being a good supplier is part of the deal.
That's worth its weight in gold. So we're a little more than halfway through today. I just want to remind everybody, you can drop your questions in the comments. It can be anything invention related. It doesn't have to necessarily, if you want to understand more about patents or copyrights or trademarks or licensing or manufacturing, doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be what we're on topic with what we're discussing today. Just feel free to drop those in. And remember that we're recording this. So if you have to drop off for any reason, you can always come back to whichever page you found us on, LinkedIn or Facebook today, and you can watch the replay. Ronan, you mentioned that you would be willing or even consider talking to somebody if they have something that might be a good fit. How would they pre-qualify themselves? What would you be willing to consider?
Well, it needs to be in the firearms field, or else there's no point in messing with me. And I would want to, again, the non-disclosure agreement. One of the things that I have learned over the years is, somebody, quote, has an idea. Well, that's nice. There can be a long distance from an idea to a manufactured product put in a box and shipped. And there are many steps along that path. I would say the farther that a person with an idea can take his invention to being what the current B school term is minimum viable product, if you've got a thing and you like 3D printed the enclosure, if it has one and it works, like you're way farther ahead than I have an idea. And I would say the farther along someone was that talked to me about it would make me more interested, because otherwise I've got to do all that. And like Bill Ruger, the rifle manufacturer, said years ago, the amount of time and money a new product takes is all of it. And so you really want to pick your battles. And like I'm really glad I didn't go into the foot peg business and made electronic scales instead.
I understand. So, folks, I hope you heard that clearly, because it's the same with licensing. The answer is pretty much the same. The more complete, the more thorough, thought out, fleshed out your idea is, rather than just an idea, maybe that you get a 3D virtual prototype done that doesn't even prove it actually works, because you can make a virtual prototype do anything. It's magic. The further you are down that path, the easier it is going to be to get a license. Now, sometimes that's not always easy, and there's certainly times to choose to do that and not to choose to do that. But that is, I think, a fairly universal rule. So good to know. When let me just talk my questions here. How are we doing, guys? Okay. So I have a working prototype. Even if you're not interested in the concept, I appreciate any tips or advice on moving closer to final production.
Well, okay. So there I'd go, have you answered the question of how you're going to sell it? Like, don't put it in production unless you know how you're going to sell it. Now, maybe you already have, not trying to be insulting, but do not put it in production without a solid plan of how you're going to sell it, to whom. And every industry has got its own sort of nature of things, the distribution channels, and some things are very much oriented toward big catalogers. Other stuff is, the Amazon world, whatever. But before you go into production, by all means, make sure you know how you're going to sell it, or try to sell it. And then, when you try something that doesn't work, don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy. Pivot, do something different.
Say that again, the last part.
I say if when you're trying something and selling and it doesn't work, don't fall for the lost sunk cost fallacy. Don't keep doing the thing that doesn't work. Pivot, change, do something.
That's what Damon tried to tell me after being on Shark Tank, and it never funded. He paid for one container that I sold through QVC, but he never funded on my deal. And at the end, when I was sinking fast, I
remember the time.
Oh yeah. I was so frustrated. And he said, well, Lisa, you have to learn not to throw good money after bad. Now, in my defense, I felt like, well, at this point, yeah, it's a sinking ship, but had it been there on time, we'll never know if that could have made the difference. But there's still truth in what he said. Don't throw good money after bad. If you start figuring around it's not work, pivot, like you said, move on, park it. Sometimes even hitting the pause button, because it's a timing issue. Like right now, you mentioned before we got on the call today, how is your supply channel working out for you these days?
Oh, it's horrible. All this stuff you hear in the news about, a shortage of what they always call chips, like they're generic potato chips, but there's not. There's hundreds of thousands of different chips that do different things. Yeah, electronic components. So we noticed this back early on in 2020 that, you just kind of got rumblings. And so in the electronic manufacturing world and maybe other areas of manufacturing, got onto a kick in the 1980s called JIT, J-I-T, just in time. And so it was driven by the bean counters. And it actually started at a Toyota plant over in the East Bay in California, where I think they make Teslas now. But the idea was you don't want to have any more inventory on hand than you need right now. So they would have trucks from their OEM suppliers with parts sitting in the parking lots of the assembly plant. And when they needed some more shock absorbers, whatever, they would get magically delivered right then. But they're not carrying on the books a ton of inventory. Also, California had an inventory tax. So in the electronic world, there are two major distributors, catalogers, and then a bunch of smaller ones. And when we want to make, 1,000 gizmos, well, we just order the parts. And they show up in the next couple of days, and we go make 1,000 gizmos. Some of those parts now have a 66-week lead time. That's a problem. And so early on in 2020, you could kind of see it. And what we did was set out to buy a year's worth of parts and put them on the shelf because we had the money to do it. And failing that, I could be put out of business for lack of a 26-cent part. And so we've done that cycle. I think we're on our third iteration of it. And I'm very delighted that I did that. What it's also done is stopped me cold. We have an electronic product that I've been working on for a couple of years on and off. And I just paused it because, unless I know I can get the parts to build it, I'm not going to go spend the money for an injection mold. And right now, I don't know that I could get those parts. I think it was caused by two things. It's not the thing you see in LA with the cargo ships. Mm-hmm. It's that I think there was a brief interruption in the actual manufacturing places due to COVID way back in 2020, but they also opened up right away. I think instead what happened is millions of little companies like me are hoarding the chips. It's like if everybody gets on the highway at the same instant, you have a traffic jam. So a whole bunch of people went, these lead times are creeping out. Oh, hell, let's buy a year's worth of parts. Well, the manufacturing pipeline of semiconductors cannot allow for people to hoard parts like we're doing. So I don't know what's going to happen. It'll get better at some point.
No way to know. It's cyclical. I mean, you and I have done this long enough that we've had to write out various different challenges in the economy or whatever. Okay, so you mentioned earlier, and if any of you missed it, he said, I don't like to work. That wasn't a joke.
No. Tim Ferriss had me in mind when he wrote the 4-Hour Work Week.
So you're living the dream. And, a lot of people are considering, whether you're considering licensing or manufacturing an OEM, whatever, the dream is to have both money and time, which tends to not really work out so well. And it sounds to me like with your OEM business model, you have basically perfected a machine that gives you both the money and time. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So what advice would you have for anybody who might be listening today that wants to go down that path for what you wish you would have known then in terms of really simple practical steps, right? Not big stuff. Like what actions can people take to explore this type of business model instead of licensing, especially if they can't get a license done?
Yeah. So, sure. So, there's innovation and there's execution, right? So I'm a pretty good innovator and I have just enough execution in me to not starve to death. The good news is my son came to work for me a few years ago and he's very good at execution and the proof is in the pudding, but he works a lot and I don't. So somebody's got to do the executing. And in the beginning, it's going to be you, the inventor person, but and I would recommend that book, by the way, 4-Hour Work Week. It's a pretty cool book. So I think that the biggest thing is if you're in a field where you can outsource the manufacturing, which you certainly can with electronics, you could probably do it with a mechanical product, but it's going to be harder, I think, or maybe I just don't know much about it. Yeah, your goal would be to completely outsource the manufacturing, have the manufactured product shipped to some distribution center, be it Amazon or a catalog or appropriate for a niche industry, to where you're just kind of out of the mix. You're not like you wouldn't be doing what we do, which is selling direct to end users. That does take some people and in-house stuff, but it's also immensely lucrative to be a manufacturer that sells to an end user at full retail. That's a win. But you could certainly structure your business in such a way that you didn't have to do much more than order more product from the contract manufacturer. Now that assumes they could get the parts, right? So there's those things. But yeah, you could do it. Like for my personality, I can't imagine like having a retail store, sitting there wishing somebody had walked through the door and cursing Amazon every day. Wouldn't work for me.
So Aubrey asks, and this, I kind of want to just add to this a little bit. How long did it take to become as stable as you are now, having perfected the OEM model? I would also add, how much money should someone be prepared to invest to develop this kind of model? Money and time.
Yeah. So the electronic company certainly could not support me at first, and I was still doing the shooting schools. And let's see, it took about a year and a half or 2 years to get where it was making enough income for me to stop doing the shooting schools. And again, we made a product that never existed before. So there wasn't a big crushing demand outside of some very high-end competitive shooters at first. That's changed completely over the years, but at first. And so the amount of money it takes is really dependent on one's level of sort of innovative intelligence. So when I started the electronic thing, I couldn't read an ohm meter. I knew nothing about electronics at all. I knew a little bit about computer stuff, but I'm a pretty quick study, and I had the advantage of not having any money. So I couldn't just go to some engineering firm and say, here's $100,000, design my product for me. I did team up with a friend of mine, Carl, who's a great guy. And he really is who did the engineering and computer science work on the first timer we built. I mean, he made a little bit of money on it, not much. We were just kind of doing it out of my kitchen. So it was very much of and I ran the thing out of my garage for years. So super low overhead. The big step costs, if you will. So you got, buying the components and the labor and all that's completely dependent on how many you want to make. Step costs for me back then that were high were buying injection molds. The price of injection molds has come way down over the years because it's not, the little Swiss watchmaker making them anymore. It's a machine. But back then, I saved up money from gun schools to buy my first injection mold for, $5,500 in 1983 or 4, which cleared out my capital.
Put you back to square one. So cost and time, it took you a couple of years before you were making enough that you could basically quit your job. And
Yes.
Who were you were selling to third party sellers?
At that point in time, we were only selling to end users. And so, back then there was a company that made radar detectors called Escort. They were out of Minnesota, and they would put these full page ads in the car magazines back when print magazines mattered. And, they were selling them factory direct. You couldn't get them anywhere except directly from them. And me and this friend of mine in Arizona, passed away recently, named Mike Dillon, he started making reloading presses. And we met at a national championship shoot, and we got to talking, and we both studied up on this company that made the Escort radar detector called Cincinnati Microwave. And we both copied their ads. We took the fonts, the colors, do it today, which later gets called call to action, but it wasn't called that then. And we would buy ads in print magazines that were appropriate to our market of niche competitive shooters. The other thing I did that was I just kind of did it on an impulse, and it worked pretty well. So back then there was only 4 or 5 people who'd ever won a major match, and when we got the first prototype timer working on the last day of the national championships, we ran out to show it to all these guys because nobody had ever seen one before because it never existed before. And I just told them all, like, here's the deal. I'm going to give you one of these things. And if you like it, let me say so in an ad. And if you don't like it, tell me what to change because it's just software, which is a ludicrous thing to say because it's just software is not easy. But so they all did it. So the first ad we ever ran in the, actually it was the publication for the competitive shooting body, we were endorsed by everybody who'd ever won a national championship or a major match and the U.S. Olympic shooting team.
Brilliant.
You know,
were you worried at all that it could go the other way?
You know, I was so young then and idiotic. I don't think failure ever occurred to me. No, I never thought it would fail.
Because that could have really gone very differently for you. So we're going to wrap up here in just a couple more minutes. If you have any questions, please get them in now. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time. And Ronin, I just really want to thank you for being here.
Oh, sure.
I know that our private conversations are much more colorful. I appreciate you outside of your comfort zone and doing this very publicly with me. I think it's important for people to learn that there are more than one way to skin a cat, right? Many, many ways to bring a product to market. And this hybrid variation of making it, but selling it to, instead of to a retailer, selling it to a catalog or other types of distributors, or in your case, even packaging your parts inside of other packages. Yes, that's one of the things you mentioned when we first got started.
I may have artfully worded that. So we have taken our products and put other people's logos on them, if that's what you're saying.
You've licensed brands and sold them that way?
No, we would go to, there's a pistol company that years ago that wanted some timers, and we put their logo on the timer. Like we took our own logo off and put theirs on.
But illegally.
However, because of and there's another little thing I should have mentioned here. The best money I've ever spent is on industrial design, and by that's the sort of the look and feel of a product. You know, so any electronic thing can be in a square box. Ours are never square boxes, and he's quite ancient now, the same industrial designer I've worked with for near 40 years. And making your product look cool and be unique and be a thing that people want to see and go, oh, that's nice. The art of it is extremely important.
Well, that's when you're selling direct to consumer, but when you're doing the OEM thing. So for example, if I were to, instead of licensing the hair accessories to Scunsy, if I were to go to them and say, hey, I'm willing to private label this for you instead, and because I have a patent on it, you can't get it anyplace else, that would be another way to do business with them, which is similar a little bit to what you were talking about when you first got started. Yes? Yeah.
I mean, you want some barrier to them not robbing you. And a patent is certainly, especially with a big company, you're talking $500 million company. They have very little interest in being sued on a patent violation because especially if they're public. Conversely, it's the little company that'll infringe on you because they know, nobody can afford to play.
Like you.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So we did have a couple more questions come in real quick here. Sorry again, Aubrey. There we go. Do you have more products in the making or more focused on improving current products? That's a great question.
The answer is yes, on the both on the trigger side, and if I can get parts on the electronic side. Absolutely.
So, making and improving. Do you allocate a certain, do you have a best practice for allocating a certain amount of your budget every year towards innovation versus marketing versus improving existing products?
I'm not really a budget guy. that
More
messy
work.
desk thing.
No, it's more
You know,
work.
and it's like sales forecasting. Give me a break. Um, but no, it's really if the idea comes along, if I think I can sell it, I pretty much know whether I can make it or not. Is it worth to some degree? I'm gonna be out of pocket on what we call a step cost, whether it's engineering or software. Um, Certainly on the triggers, which are we call them fire control mechanisms. You have a tremendous ethical obligation to make sure it's a safe product. So we take great pains in that area, including having for real licensed engineers analyze the product before it ever goes out the door to make sure you're not going to hurt somebody.
Yeah, that's
If anyone familiar with the firearm industry, they know about the Remington trigger problem, where they purposely cheapened a trigger back in the 50s, I think it was, and people have gotten killed. Like that's a no-go.
Yeah, especially in your business. Okay, last question here. And Kanan, I hope I'm saying your name right. Would it be tough to convince a somewhat aligned product manufacturer to invest in the product and get paid or payment through the sale? So I'm guessing he's talking about like a rev share opportunity for launching. It's creative financing. I like the question. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, if you could get through to the decision maker and make your pitch. And also companies that are sort of owner run, in my experience, are a lot more agile and can make a decision. Companies that have an owner or a big investment group behind them that are driven by financials, I think that's a harder nut to crack. Just because their decision matrix is going to be different.
Yeah.
Like I can look at something and go yes, no. I don't answer to anybody, which I like.
Goes back to working less. So
Exactly.
that was a question. Even with regard to licensing, I have, in fact, a product that I'm working on now. I reached out to a company that I thought would be a good distributor for it in direct response business before I even invented it, to get the feedback, like Ronin mentioned earlier. And then they actually even invest a little bit to help me get the 3D animated video done. They did it for me and partnered, and now we'll be, of course, partners on the licensing deal in the end. So there are lots of ways to be creative about financing your projects and your ideas, as long as you're smart about it and take these little steps, like Ronin said. I mean, look, everybody thinks it's just this huge glamorous business, and yet there's you read all the books and the business schools and that, and with the 4-hour work week, and what was the other one you said? Oh, Innovation Dilemma. The Innovation Dilemma by Clayton.
Innovator's Dilemma, I think is what it's called. It's like an 80s book.
Yep, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen is who that was. Yeah, out of Harvard. Anyway, there's lots of great books. You can learn how to do this yourself. It's not that it's hard. You don't have to be super fancy about it. Anybody can do this, and that was my point. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll wrap up here. Ronin, thank you so much.
See you, my friend. Be well. Say hi to your mom for me.
Stick around with me for a second. You all have a great day.